I paid for a hole in a woman's roof. Then I slept under it. She fed me cornbread, black coffee. Her daughter smiled at me across the table. And the whole night, water dripped into a bucket 6 inches from my face. When I got home, I typed her insurance company into my system. Took me 11 seconds. My fund built the machine that denied her claim 9 times in 14 months. That's one policyholder. You're describing a rounding error. A rounding error. That's what you call an 11-year-old girl sleeping on a mattress on the floor because her ceiling collapsed onto her bed? $680. That's what your company offered her. You know what she did with it? She stapled it inside her dead husband's cigar box. Refused to sign. Because the back of that check said full and final. And she loved her daughter more than she needed your money.
This is an investor meeting, not a courtroom.
Sit down. 1,400 more files are exactly like hers. I know which budget line paid your bonus for closing them. Every person in this room got rich from that woman's ceiling. Tonight, you're going to hear exactly how.
2 springs before the meeting that left a room full of investors silent, a hailstorm came down on Dallas County, Alabama, while Mabel Joyner was standing behind the farm supply counter weighing a bag of okra seeds for an old man she knew by face. The storm came so fast that the local radio hadn't even changed its tone yet. The sky had only turned gray at 4:12. By 4:20, hail the size of fingertips was hammering the store's tin roof, bouncing as dry beans poured into a metal bucket. Mabel looked through the glass door and saw the pickup trucks in the lot shaking under each push of wind. She called home. Nola Mae picked up after the 5th ring. "Where are you?" "In the hallway, Mama. I brought my pillow out." "Stay away from the windows. Don't open the door no matter who calls." The 11-year-old girl said yes, but the way she tried to sound normal made Mabel close her eyes for 1 second. Since the day Earl died, Nola Mae had learned to say she was fine before anyone asked a second time. That wasn't growing up. That was a kind of childhood forced to set its fear lower than an adult's shoulders. 20 minutes later, the storm had passed. Mabel asked her manager to leave early, but he only let her go after the cash drawer had been counted. She drove the Chevy down country roads covered with torn leaves. When she reached the wooden house at the end of the red dirt road, she saw the tarp over the shed had blown away. On the main roof, several asphalt shingles had curled up like fingernails being ripped back. Nola Mae stood under the porch, holding the camera Earl had once bought at a pawn shop. The girl went crying. She only pointed toward the ceiling in her bedroom. Mabel stepped inside and walked through the smell of damp wood and drywall dust. In the middle of Nola Mae's bed was a small wet spot, not yet bigger than the mouth of a cup, but it was right where the girl usually laid her head. Mabel pulled an aluminum basin from under the sink and set it on the bed. Water fell drop by drop into the bottom of the basin. The sound was small, but inside a house that had just gone through a storm, it sounded like a new bill. Earl had died 3 years earlier in a lumber mill outside Selma. 19 months of fighting for survivor benefits had taught Mabel everything through rejection. The wrong line on the form, a missing doctor's signature. The company needed a new copy. This office told her to call that office. On the day the first payment finally came, she didn't open the envelope right away. She set it on the table first, then sat down to read it. That hailstorm night, Mabel climbed onto a kitchen chair and took Earl's wooden cigar box from the top of the refrigerator. Earl had once kept screws, gas receipts, and scraps of paper with lumber measurements inside it. After he died, Mabel turned it into the place for anything that was not allowed to get lost. Certified mail receipts, printed photos, temporary repair bills, response letters, notes written in blue ballpoint pen. She opened the box, smoothed out a clean stack of white paper, and wrote the date in the top corner. Nola Mae stood beside the table, her braid crooked. "Is the roof real bad, Mama?" Mabel didn't answer right away. She picked up her phone, opened the date and time on the screen, and showed it to her daughter. "From now on, after every rain, you take pictures of the roof for me. Take a picture of the date on the phone screen first, then the watermark, then the ceiling, then the yard outside. Don't make it pretty. Make it clear." Nola Mae frowned. "For the insurance?" Mabel nodded. She took an old envelope and wrote roof on the front. "So when they say they don't see it, we'll have something for them to read." "But can't we just call and tell them?" Mabel looked at her daughter. She wanted to save one part of the world for the girl, a part where a poor person's words still had weight. But on top of the refrigerator, the cigar box had grown heavy with the month she had once waited for phone calls nobody returned. She pulled out a chair for Nola Mae to sit beside her. "They don't listen to crying, baby. They read paperwork." The girl went quiet, then held the camera with both hands. Mabel led her out into the yard. Red dirt stuck to their sandals. The air after the storm still smelled of crushed leaves and broken pine sap. Mother and daughter stood under the edge of the porch and looked up at the roof March had just bitten through. Mabel held the phone in front of the camera so the date and time would show. Nola Mae took the first picture. The small screen flashed, catching a curled shingle, a wet streak below the gutter, and Mabel's hand at the edge of the frame. That night, Mabel didn't move the basin off her daughter's bed. She moved Nola May into her own bed, placed old towels around the bottom of the basin, and sat at the kitchen table filling out the first claim form. Her ballpoint pen ran out of ink halfway through. She searched the drawer and found a promotional pen from the funeral home that had handled Earl's service. In the bedroom, water was still falling. On the table, the cigar box sat open, so ordinary that nobody in that house could have imagined that one day the papers inside it would be read in front of a room full of millionaires. That night, it was only the old box of a dead husband sitting under a roof that had started to leak. Coverstone's first letter arrived on an April afternoon, just after Mabel had finished mopping the church floor and still had the smell of bleach on her wrists. The white envelope lay inside the bent mailbox, dry in a way that felt almost insulting, while the back porch roof was still dripping into the aluminum basin in the middle of Nola May's room. She brought it into the kitchen, wiped her hands, and used a butter knife to slice open the edge. Nola May sat across from her, doing homework in a notebook with a wet corner. In the letter, Dale Kern, the claims adjuster, wrote that after reviewing the photos and damage description, the company had determined the roof damage was mainly related to natural wear, material age, and long-term maintenance, and therefore did not fall under hailstorm coverage. The language was very polite. There was no rough sentence. There was no word ugly enough for a person to point at and know exactly where to be angry. Mabel read it a second time, folded the letter along its old crease, and opened Earl's cigar box on top of the refrigerator. She placed the letter in the left section, beside the photos of the roof Nola May had taken after the storm. Then she took a new form, wrote the policy number, claim number, date of damage, and called the print shop to ask about prices. That night, Nola May watched her mother put stamps on a certified mail envelope. The girl asked if they would believe them this time. Mabel didn't answer with hope. She only handed her daughter a photo, pointed to the corner with the date and time, and said that clear things had to be sent back even clearer. In June, the second denial letter arrived. This time, the reason wasn't wear and tear. Coverstone said the damage notice had been submitted late under the policy terms. Mabel stood at the sink, her hand still dusted with cornmeal while she was making dinner, and read that sentence under the yellow kitchen light. She went to get the cigar box, took out the first certified mail receipt stamped by the post office 3 days after the hailstorm. She set the receipt beside the denial letter, photographed both together, and called the number at the bottom of the page. The man said he completely understood her frustration. Unfortunately, the file showed the documents had not been updated to the correct department at the time of review. Mabel stood beside the refrigerator, looking at the water stain on her daughter's ceiling, which had spread into the shape of an open hand. She asked whether he could send that explanation in writing, with the adjuster's name included. The other end of the line went quiet for half a beat. Then Dale said he would note the request. From that day on, that sentence became Mabel's small hammer. Whenever anyone at Coverstone explained something by phone, she asked them to put it in writing, with a date and a name. She didn't raise her voice. She only took a ballpoint pen from the cup beside the phone and wrote each word on the back of the electric bill. A week later, Coverstone said the file had been reassigned to a new adjuster for an objective review. The new person was named Brenda. Brenda said she needed the full set of documents from the beginning because the internal transfer was missing a few photos. Mabel set the phone down, opened the cigar box, and took out the backup copy she had already clipped together with a rubber band. She replaced the cover sheet, wrote Brenda's name, stamped it, and sent it by certified mail. 6 weeks passed. Nola May moved her study desk out of the corner of her bedroom because the drywall on the ceiling had started to swell. Mabel worked at the farm supply store until 5, ate a quick egg sandwich in the car, then went to the church to mop the fellowship hall. Every time it rained, Nola May stood in the yard and took pictures of the roof. Some nights the wind was so strong the girl had to hold the camera with both hands while Mabel held the back of her shirt. Brenda disappeared from the file in August. The third person, Carl, called and said he had just received the case and needed to verify everything from the beginning. When Mabel heard the words from the beginning, she pulled out a chair and sat down. She looked at the cigar box, looked at the envelopes she had already sent, and asked Carl whether he wanted the documents by certified mail or email with read confirmation. Carl replied politely that either way was fine. She sent both. If you have ever been spun around by an insurance company like this, tell me what state you're watching from. I want to see the map of this thing because one file by itself looks personal, but many files placed side by side start to look like a system. Tully Mason's house next door also had a blue tarp after that hailstorm. He was a retired electrician who had once helped Earl replace the outlet on the porch. Coverstone sent him a check so small he gave a dry laugh when he showed it to Mabel. He said a lawsuit wasn't worth it and he would patch it enough to get through the season. That weekend, he nailed plywood under the porch roof, sealed around the vent pipe himself, and put a bucket in the living room. By September, the smell of mold had started to stick to his curtains. Tully coughed more often when he came over to ask Mabel for a little waterproof tape. One Monday morning, she saw a rental truck parked in front of his house. Tully loaded a few cardboard boxes, an old armchair, and a framed photo of his late wife into the truck bed. He said he was going up to Montgomery to stay with his sister for a while. He said for a while, but the key trembled in his hand when he locked the door. That night, the house next door went dark for the first time since Mabel had moved there. Mabel's file kept getting transferred. Carl became Denise. Denise became Howard. Every new name came with an apology, an extension code, and a request to resend documents that had already been sent. 9 times in the first 14 months, Mabel stood at the post office counter with a thick envelope in her hands, paying for postage with $1 bills from her wallet. The postal clerk began to recognize her. Once, the woman didn't even ask for the address anymore. She just weighed the envelope and printed the receipt. The yellow stain spread slowly from the corner of the window toward the light fixture. Mabel marked the edge of the stain every month and wrote a small date beside it. Nola May no longer asked when the roof would be fixed. She only took the pictures, printed them from the cheap machine at the drugstore, and handed them to her mother while the photos were still warm. One late October evening, Mabel placed the 9th receipt into the cigar box. The lid no longer closed all the way. She pressed down, but the papers inside pushed upward like something trying to breathe. Outside, Tully Mason's house sat still in the dark. Inside Mabel's house, water fell into the basin in Nola May's room more steadily than before, and every drop knew exactly who it was waiting to wear down first. Mabel's greatest hope came on an evening when she had to iron her black dress in the kitchen because Nola May's bedroom had become the place where the buckets were kept. The old iron gave off weak steam. She spread a towel over the chair, pressed each wrinkle out of the hem, then hung the dress on the refrigerator handle like a cheap piece of armor. The next morning, she drove to the public library in Selma to photocopy the file for the State Insurance Commission. In her cloth bag were certified mail receipts, roof photos, denial letters, call notes, and pictures of Nola May's ceiling turning from pale yellow to gray-brown month by month. She arranged each stack by date. The librarian asked if she needed staples. Mabel nodded and took a large manila envelope. She paid for the copies with loose change from a glass jar. When she walked back to the parking lot, she sat in the Chevy for a few more minutes with both hands on the steering wheel, not to pray. She was only checking one more time that she had written the correct claim number. For Mabel, faith was no longer a feeling in her chest. It was a date written correctly, an address with no missing house number, and a signature placed in the right box. 3 weeks later, the commission sent a letter confirming it had received her complaint. Mabel read that sentence aloud to Nola May while the girl was working on fraction problems. Nola May looked up, her eyes brighter than usual. That night, mother and daughter ate canned beans with cornbread, and Mabel gave the girl the last piece of butter. She didn't say they would win, but for the first time in months, she placed the basin under the ceiling without looking at it like someone who was losing. Vicki Dunn, Coverstone's regional vice president of claims, responded on time. She didn't call Mabel. Dunn's letter sounded cooperative, each sentence polished smooth enough to leave no sharp edge. Coverstone acknowledged it had reviewed the file again, confirmed the claim had been handled properly, and as a show of goodwill included a check for $680. The calculation sheet listed the damage after depreciation as $3,180 minus the $2,500 deductible. Mabel read the calculation sheet 3 times. $680 wasn't enough to replace the roof. It was only enough to buy more TARP, asthma medicine for Nola May, and pay a few bills lying face down on the table. But in the letter, the way that number was presented made it look like a lawful gift, while her anger looked like something that didn't understand math. A week later, the commission's letter arrived. The state agency closed the complaint because the company had responded properly and issued payment under the policy terms. Mabel stood on the porch reading the letter while the mail truck drove away, leaving red dust on the road. She folded the paper, walked into the kitchen, opened the cigar box, and laid it on top of the stack of receipts. Nola May asked if that meant it was over. Mabel turned the pot of beans down low and said it only meant they were done reading their part. In November, she took a half-day off from the farm supply store and drove to Montgomery to meet a lawyer. His office was on the 2nd floor of an old brick building, and the stairwell smelled of damp paper and cold coffee. The gray-haired lawyer flipped through the file, stopped for a long time at the photos of the ceiling, then looked at the check. He wasn't rude. That was what made the answer harder to swallow. The case was too small to sue over Mom. Inspection costs, filing fees, and the time it would take could eat everything she hoped to recover. He pushed a tissue box toward her, but Mabel didn't take one. On the way home, she stopped at a gas station and put in only $12 because she still had to buy Nola May's inhaler. Her phone buzzed with a message saying the farm supply store was cutting her hours because sales were low during the rainy season. She read the message under the gas station awning, still holding the pump handle. The wind blew the smell of gasoline into her shirt. She returned the nozzle, then sat in the car for one more minute before starting the engine. The ceiling collapsed in early December during an ordinary rain, no thunder, no hail. Just water that had been passing through the weak spot long enough. Nola May was eating dinner in the kitchen when the bedroom made a dry cracking sound, and then a section of drywall fell onto the bed, breaking apart over the pillow and blanket. White dust rolled out through the doorway. Mabel ran in and saw black water soaking down from the opening in the ceiling into the middle of the mattress. Nola May didn't scream. She stood in the doorway, holding her plate of cold rice, looking at the bed the way a child might look at a friend who had been hit. That night, Mabel dragged the mattress into the living room. She put her daughter under the window that leaked less, propped bricks under the sofa legs to keep water from spreading, and tried to sleep. Around midnight, Nola May coughed so hard her shoulders shook. Her breathing scraped through her small throat. Mabel wrapped her in a blanket, drove to the emergency room, and sat under white lights until almost morning with another bill tucked into her coat pocket. When she got home, she didn't change clothes. She pulled a chair under the collapsed part of the ceiling, held a flashlight between her teeth, and used tape to press plastic over the hole. The chair shook every time she reached higher. Nola May stood below, holding the roll of tape, her face still pale after the night at the hospital. Mabel only reached down for more tape. She didn't let her daughter see how tightly her jaw was biting down around the flashlight. By the 13th month, the check was still in the box. One night, after Nola May had fallen asleep on the living room mattress, Mabel set it on the table. On the back in small print were the words, "Full and final payment for this claim." She placed a pen beside the signature line. The water inside the bucket changed rhythm when the wind slipped through the roof gap. She sat there for a long time, looking at the money that could buy medicine, tarp, and a few more weeks of breathing. In the end, Mabel didn't sign. She took a stapler, opened the lid of Earl's cigar box, and stapled the check to the inside of the lid, where she would have to see it every time she opened the box, not as money, not as defeat, as proof of how cheaply they wanted to buy her silence. In May of the second year, the storm returned to Dallas County like an old debt collector. By afternoon, the clouds had lowered over the abandoned cotton fields. By evening, the power went out across the whole line. Mabel's house had only the oil lamp on the kitchen table, its flame moving across the stains on the ceiling. Nola May lay on the living room mattress, holding a one-eyed stuffed bear. Mabel set a coffee pot on the little gas stove and checked the bucket under the leak above the sofa. Water fell steadily, then faster when the wind pushed rain against the south side of the roof. She changed the towel under the bucket, pulled the plastic sheet a little farther, then looked out toward the porch. The blue tarp on the roof swelled like a tired lung. More than 2 miles away, Lawrence Beaumont stood beside a black sedan that had died on the side of a back road. The 2 tires on the right side had been torn open by a piece of metal from a broken road sign. He had only one spare. The phone in his coat pocket had been off since morning. He had turned it off on purpose after signing the papers to sell his mother's last house outside Selma, because every call from Atlanta had turned the funeral into a meeting schedule. The GPS had led him off the flooded highway and onto a red dirt road. Cell service disappeared. The car's SOS button only blinked uselessly. In the trunk was a box of his mother's things, a few picture frames, handkerchiefs, and a brown ledger tied with a rubber band. Beaumont stood in the rain, then opened the trunk and lifted the box as if it were the only thing that shouldn't be left behind in a strange car at night. He walked toward the only light he could see beyond the pines. His leather shoes sank into the mud. Rainwater ran from his shirt collar down his back. The expensive suit slowly grew heavy like a worker's coat after an outdoor shift. When he reached the porch steps, he would later remember the exact time, 9:40 at night, because the church bell at the end of the road had just finished half a ring when he raised his hand and knocked. Mabel didn't open the door right away. She placed a hand on Nola May's shoulder, signaling the girl to move back into the kitchen, then picked up the oil lamp and went to the door. Through the crack in the wood, she saw a white man standing in the rain, gray hair stuck to his forehead, both arms holding a wet cardboard box. He wasn't drunk, he wasn't holding a weapon, but a stormy night was not the time for a woman living alone with her daughter to trust a stranger's politeness. "My car broke down," he said over the rain. "I don't have any phone signal. I just need somewhere to stay until morning." Mabel looked at him for a few more seconds, then she opened the door with the chain still on. "Wipe your feet. Put that box somewhere dry. You can sleep on the sofa. When the rain stops in the morning, you go on safely." Beaumont nodded as if he had just signed a contract with no conditions. He wiped his shoes on the old rag until Mabel was satisfied, then stepped inside. The house was small, but everything had its place. Basins, buckets, towels, the oil lamp, the cigar box on top of the refrigerator. Poverty didn't make the house messy. The rain did. Mabel cut him a warm piece of cornbread and poured coffee boiled on the gas stove. Beaumont started to refuse, but his stomach betrayed him with a small sound. Nola May heard it and lowered her face, smiling behind her glass of water. He accepted the plate with both hands and said thank you very quietly. They ate under the oil lamp, no television, no phones. Only the wind pulling at the roof, the rain hitting the tarp, and water dripping into the bucket beside the sofa. Beaumont looked up at the leak, then toward the blue tarp lit by the porch light through the window. The insurance company says the storm didn't make it, Mabel said, without needing him to finish the question. The storm seems to disagree. He looked at her. In his world, people used jokes to hide discomfort. Mabel used one so she didn't have to explain the wound too many times. She didn't tell him all 14 months. She only pulled the cigar box down, opened the lid, and showed him the receipts layered inside. The $680 check was stapled to the inside of the lid. Beaumont read that number longer than politeness allowed. At midnight, Mabel and Nola May slept in the inner room. Beaumont lay on the sofa under a thin blanket, his eyes open. Drops from the ceiling fell into the bucket near his head. Whenever the bucket became nearly half full, the sound of the water changed into a duller tone. He sat up, carried the bucket to the porch, emptied it, and placed it back under the leak. The first time, he set it slightly off-center. The drops hit the rim and splashed onto the floor. He moved the bucket left, waited 3 beats, then adjusted it one more time until it was right under the drip. The next morning, the rain thinned into fine lines. Mabel fried the leftover cornbread in a cast-iron skillet. Beaumont opened the box of his mother's things to find a dryer shirt, and the brown ledger fell out onto the table. Mabel accidentally saw the tiny writing inside. The names of houses his mother had once cleaned, the money neighbors had borrowed, and nickel and dime amounts written in pencil. Beside the ledger was Earl's cigar box, the lid still open, its receipts and roof photos swelling under the early sunlight. Beaumont stood between those 2 boxes for a long time. He no longer saw a strange woman. He saw his mother, a woman who had once come home with swollen wrists from scrubbing rich people's bathtubs, still writing down every penny so no one could tell her she remembered wrong. Nola May sat at the edge of the table, eating. She looked at him and asked in the serious voice of a child who had heard too many adult stories, "Mama says insurance is when you pay someone to keep a promise. What do you do for work?" Beaumont set his coffee cup down. The answer he always used in boardrooms suddenly felt too smooth to say in front of this child. "I invest in promises." Mabel glanced up. She didn't ask anything else, but her eyes held that sentence the way they would hold an unsigned piece of paper. Beaumont looked at the blue tarp, then his mother's ledger, and said that if she wanted, he might be able to help handle this. He still hadn't said who he was. He also didn't yet understand how close he was standing to something. Mabel closed the cigar box. "I don't need anyone to handle it for me. I need them to read what I already sent." He had no answer. When a plumber stopped by to give him a ride to somewhere with cell service, Beaumont thanked Mabel once more. Before leaving, he quietly slipped 3 $20 bills into the coffee can on the kitchen counter. The pickup rolled away from the porch through the red mud. Mabel cleared the dishes, opened the coffee can, and saw the money. She picked up the 3 bills, smoothed them flat, and placed them beside the cigar box. Outside in the yard, Nola May raised the camera and took a picture of the blue tarp after the storm. At the edge of the porch in that photo were the muddy prints of expensive leather shoes, and no one in that house yet knew those shoes would come back. Atlanta welcomed Lawrence Beaumont with shining glass, elevators, and stacked emails. When the tow truck hauled the sedan to the dealership, he stood in the office bathroom changing into a dry shirt, but the cuff still had a streak of red mud from the road in front of Mabel's house. He looked at it for a few seconds and didn't wash it off right away. On his desk on the 36th floor, his assistant had placed a schedule of calls with 3 partners. Beaumont ignored all of them. He opened his computer and typed Coverstone into the fund system. A chain of companies appeared, Coverstone Mutual, the parent company above it, and then the equity group that Beaumont Capital held through 2 pension funds. He didn't curse. He only pulled the chair out and sat down more slowly than usual. Mabel Joyner's name was not on those lines. The wooden house, the bucket, the blue tarp, and Nola May were not there either. On the screen, there were only returns, loss ratios, and margins. But the farther he scrolled, the more he realized that his money had gone through the same door he had knocked on the night before. He called the analysis department and requested the old files. 17 minutes later, a staffer sent him the slide deck from 4 years earlier. Beaumont vaguely remembered that meeting. He had sat between 2 calls, drinking cold coffee, skimming to the page on claims cost control. At the time, one phrase had passed by in 11 seconds. File discipline, reduce leakage. Right below it was a projected 19% return. He had not asked where that leakage was leaking from. He had not asked who would be standing under the hole when the number was reduced. He had only nodded, because the next slide had a green chart moving upward. That afternoon, Beaumont canceled lunch with a state senator. He drove a rental car back to Dallas County himself. The dirt road had half dried, but the tires still rolled through ruts of mud. He didn't turn into Mabel's yard. He stopped at the end of the road, lowered the window, and placed his hands on the steering wheel. Daylight made everything harder to deny. 2 houses away, another blue tarp was held down with bricks. Through a wire fence, a porch roof sagged, the wood along the edge already black from moisture. Farther down, Tully Mason's house was locked, one corner of the tarp torn open by the wind. Beaumont began counting. One finger curled down against the steering wheel, then a second, a third. He drove slowly another 200 yards, stopped again, and kept counting. 7 tarped roofs out of 11 houses along that road. 7 promises hanging from ropes, broken bricks, and waterproof tape. Nola May's sentence returned to his mind. Insurance is when you pay someone to keep a promise. He had told a child he invested in promises. He had never asked what happened when a promise wasn't kept. He could have written a check that day. Mabel's roof would have been repaired before the weekend. Nola May would have her bedroom back. The bucket on the sofa would disappear. With his wealth, the amount was so small an accountant could record it as personal giving. But Beaumont stayed still in the car. He looked at Mabel's house through the windshield and saw her standing in the yard holding her phone in front of the camera so Nola May could take another roof photo after the storm. She didn't know he was there. Mother and daughter were still doing their part, as if the world only needed to be shown clearly enough and would finally feel shame. He understood that paying only Mabel now would not feel like making things right. It would feel like buying back one night of shelter, like putting a price on the kindness of the woman who had given him cornbread while the power was out. Worse, it would leave the other 7 blue tarps swelling under the rain while he gave himself permission to feel better. Could one kind night erase 14 months that his money, even if he had not signed anything directly, had pressed down on another person's roof? That question could split any comment section in half. But on that red dirt road, Beaumont didn't need anyone to argue it for him. He only needed to look long enough. The phone on his dashboard buzzed. Gordon Voss, his partner, was calling from Atlanta. Beaumont didn't answer. He opened his notes app and typed 3 lines: Coverstone, Selma area claims, leakage reduction program. Then he added one final line: find out what Mabel Joyner sent and who got paid not to read it. Mabel found page 31 at 2 in the morning, not because she was smarter than anyone at Coverstone. She found it because water was falling onto the sofa again. Nola May had just fallen asleep after a coughing fit, and there was nothing left in the house to do except keep reading the kind of contract that seemed designed to make people give up. She sat under the desk lamp, drugstore reading glasses low on the bridge of her nose. On the table were the insurance policy, the $680 check stapled inside the lid of the cigar box, and a cup of coffee that had gone cold. Mabel used a pencil to underline each line. Any clause she didn't understand, she copied into a notebook and looked up in the dictionary she had borrowed from church. Page 31 was near the end of the packet, after the small print about depreciation and the duty to reduce further damage. Mabel read it once. Then she read it again. If the company and the policyholder did not agree on the value of the damage after coverage had been acknowledged, both sides had the right to request an independent appraisal. She sat up straight. There was only the sound of the old refrigerator starting up in the kitchen and water hitting the bottom of the bucket. But on the table, Dunn's check suddenly changed meaning. It was no longer only an insult. It was proof that Coverstone had admitted there was covered damage. They had bet she would never read as far as page 31. The next morning, Mabel called 3 appraisers. The first one wouldn't take a small case. The second one said his schedule was full for 2 months. The third, Lyle Potter from north of Montgomery, said the fee for an independent inspection was $450 paid up front. Mabel thanked him, wrote down the address, and set the phone beside the cigar box. In the shed behind the house, Earl's table saw was covered with a thin layer of dust. He had once used it to cut boards for shelves in Nola May's room. Mabel opened the shed door, pulled the tarp off the iron table, and stood still for a moment in the smell of old machine oil and pine wood. She wiped the blade with an oily rag, then wiped the handwheel and the edge of the table too, as if the buyer was not allowed to think Earl had ever been careless with it. The man from the next town arrived late in the afternoon. He checked the machine, listened to the motor run, then handed her $460 in cash. When he asked why she was selling it, Mabel placed her hand on the iron table one last time. Buying paperwork, she said. He didn't ask anything else. After the truck pulled away, the shed had a clear, empty space in it. Mabel stood at the doorway, counted the money twice, kept $10 aside for gas, then tucked the rest into an envelope with Lyle Potter's name written on it. 3 days later, the appraisal request was sent by certified mail. Coverstone answered with a familiar sentence. Her file was being transferred to a new department for review before the request could be confirmed. This time, Mabel did not send everything from the beginning. She photocopied the list of 9 old receipts, numbered each reassignment, included a copy of the $680 check and the clause from page 31, and sent it straight to Coverstone's legal office. On the last line, she wrote that all future communication should be answered in writing, with the name of the person responsible. That same week, Lawrence Beaumont sat across from Gordon Voss in a glass conference room. Gordon placed a profit analysis on the table and tapped his finger against the growth column. Pulling out of Coverstone now, Gordon said, would not only mean losing an investment. It would make 3 co-investment funds question the stability of Beaumont Capital. Whit Garrison had already called 2 people on the board and told them Lawrence had just lost his mother and was reacting emotionally. Beaumont did not look at the profit column. He looked at the map of the Selma area, where Mabel's road was circled in red. Gordon added that in their world, reputations did not fall apart because of one wrong decision. They fell apart when other people began to think you could no longer calculate money. Beaumont folded the map and put it in his jacket pocket. For the first time in many years, he left a meeting without making a conclusion. That alone already had a price. Mabel began knocking on every door along the Blue Tarp Road that weekend. She didn't bring promises. She brought a stack of forms, a few empty envelopes, and a ballpoint pen tied to a clipboard with string. The first house was Mrs. Ellison's, whose kitchen roof leaked whenever rain blew sideways. Then came the Reed brothers' house, where 2 children slept in the same room because the back room was badly molded. Tully Mason wasn't there anymore, but Mabel wrote down his Montgomery address from the note taped inside the mailbox. Some people were hesitant. Some had already cashed their small checks and tried to forget. Mabel didn't push. She only opened the cigar box and showed them the 9 receipts and the check stapled to the lid. By Sunday afternoon, her kitchen table held 11 claim files: roof photos, denial letters, small checks, call notes. Nola May sorted them by street name, using colored paper clips to tell the families apart. The Joyner room was born that way, with no sign, no grant money, just a kitchen table, a lamp, and neighbors sitting folding chairs, learning how to write down dates before telling their pain. Late that afternoon, Beaumont came back. He brought a new coffee can and the 3 $20 bills Mabel had smoothed flat inside an envelope. She placed the envelope in his hand right there on the porch. "You paid for a place to sleep. I didn't rent you a room." Beaumont looked at the envelope, then up at the tarp on the roof. He didn't argue. Mabel didn't invite him in right away either. Only when Nola May called from the kitchen that the cornbread was about to burn did she open the door wider. Beaumont stepped inside and wiped his feet more carefully than he had the first time. Sunday dinner was stewed beans, cornbread, and watered-down sweet tea. Beaumont sat at the edge of the table, listening to Mrs. Ellison describe how the company had changed adjusters 3 times, and listening to Reed talk about how his son had started coughing in his sleep. Beaumont didn't take notes in front of them. He washed dishes after dinner, his sleeves rolled up, his expensive watch lying face down beside the sink. When he placed the last plate on the rack, Mabel stood by the kitchen table checking the file list. Beside Earl's cigar box was a stack of papers from the whole road. Beaumont looked at that stack and understood that Mabel had done what he had not. She had turned one whole into collective proof, and outside men like Whit Garrison had already begun whispering that he had become too soft-hearted to manage other people's money. It took Coverstone 6 weeks to do something that should have taken 2 phone calls. Every Monday morning, Mabel checked the mailbox before going to the farm supply store. Every Thursday afternoon, she called the legal office number, read out the claim number, and listened to a polite voice say the appraisal schedule was still being arranged. They were no longer denying her. They had only placed her in a longer hallway where every door carried a sign that said, "Please wait a little longer." Lyle Potter, the independent appraiser, called it back at the end of the 6th week. He said he could come the following Wednesday at 8 in the morning if Coverstone sent a representative on time. Mabel wrote the date on the calendar hanging beside the refrigerator. Nola May stood on a chair to see it, then circled the square with a pencil in a very dark line. The girl didn't ask whether the roof would be fixed that day. She only asked if they needed to take more pictures before Wednesday. Mabel said yes, photograph everything. On Thursday night, the weather report on Earl's little radio changed its tone. A band of tropical storm leftovers from the Gulf of Mexico was moving up through Alabama and was expected to reach Dallas County over the weekend. It wasn't a big storm in the way that weather people gave it a name and showed red maps on television. It was just enough rain, enough wind, enough for an insurance company to look at a damaged roof and say the old damage and new damage had gotten mixed together. Mabel turned off the radio with her thumb. On the kitchen table, the 11 neighbor files sat in a stack. Earl's cigar box was in the middle like an anchor holding everything from drifting away. She opened the policy and read again the part about the duty to reduce further damage. If there was a loss, the homeowner had to take reasonable action to keep the loss from spreading. It sounded harmless, but in Coverstone's hands, it could become a rope around her neck. If she didn't cover the roof, they would say she neglected it. If she covered it wrong, they would say she ruined the evidence. On Friday morning, Mabel called Pastor Clayton at the church. By afternoon, he called back with 4 men who had ladders, tie-downs, and experience patching roofs after storms. Beaumont also appeared before sunset, driving a rented pickup, wearing a thick cotton shirt and jeans so new the cuff still had creases. He didn't come into the house like an honored guest. He got out of the truck, pulled gloves from his back pocket, and stood beside the churchman, waiting to be given a job. Mabel looked at him for a moment. "Do you know how to tie down a tarp? Not enough to be in charge? Then carry things." He nodded. From that moment, Lawrence Beaumont was no longer the man who sat in glass conference rooms in Atlanta. He was one more wet-backed shirt in a line of people passing lumber, pulling rope, and holding ladders. When Pastor Clayton said they needed more sandbags, Beaumont carried sandbags. When Reed said someone had to hold the tarp edge against the wind, Beaumont braced it with both hands until his wrists turned red. Mabel did not climb onto the roof. She stood in the yard, managing the paperwork and photos. Nola May wore a plastic bag around the camera against her chest and moved from corner to corner like someone with a real assignment. Before each photo, the girl held her mother's phone in the frame so the date and time would show. She photographed the tarp edge before the nails went in, the rope around the vent pipe, the sandbags placed under the porch roof, and every old pockmark still visible around the curled shingles. At one point, the wind lifted the tarp and a whole green corner snapped open like it wanted to pull two men down into the yard with it. Mabel looked up and didn't shout, she only pointed left. Pastor Clayton understood and pulled the rope the other way. Mud splashed up onto Beaumont's collar, but he still held the edge of the tarp with both hands, his head lowered as if he were taking orders from the roof itself. Near evening, the new tarp was finally stretched into place. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't flat, but it had a slope for water to run off. It was tied to strong points, and there were photos proving every step. Nola May took the final picture from across the road. In the frame were the small house, the blue tarp, the men standing in the yard, and Beaumont at the edge of the photo, washing mud from his hands with the outdoor hose. That night, the rain came at 11:37. Mabel knew the time because Nola May was still awake, writing it in her little notebook. The whole family lay in the living room, but no one really slept. Rain hit the tarp in wide waves. Wind pushed under the roof, making the tie-downs whistle softly around the vent pipe. At one moment, the tarp swelled and then dropped, as if the whole house had taken a hard breath. Beaumont did not stay inside the house. He slept on a folding chair at the church with the other men, in case anyone on the road needed help in the middle of the night. But before he left, he had placed 2 extra flashlights and a fresh pack of batteries on the kitchen table. Mabel didn't thank him right away. She only checked the batteries, removed the receipt from its plastic bag, and placed it in the evidence box. Nola May sat beside her mother, listening to the roof breathe. Every time the tarp snapped hard, the girl looked up at the ceiling. Mabel placed a hand on her daughter's knee, not rubbing it, not over-comforting her. A child who had been photographing damage for 14 months didn't need to be told everything was okay. She needed to see that the adults didn't run. The storm passed close to dawn. The yard was full of red puddles. The tarp had held. Mabel put on her shoes and stepped onto the porch, looked at the still-tight ropes, and then called Nola May. The girl came out in a thin jacket, her hair messy, her eyes swollen from staying awake. She took pictures of the roof after the storm, pictures of the water below the gutter, pictures of the bedroom ceiling, where the plastic was still taped up but had not fallen any farther. Wednesday arrived with a pale sky and the smell of wet dirt. Lyle Potter drove his white truck into the yard at 7:58. He was about 60, sunburned, wearing rubber boots and carrying a toolbox with a tape measure, marker, and flashlight. Coverstone's representative arrived 17 minutes late, a young man named Miller in a clean polo shirt and shoes that didn't belong in the mud. He looked at the tarp, looked at the house, and said it should be noted that the weekend weather might complicate the separation of damages. Mabel didn't answer. She handed Lyle a stack of printed photos labeled by month. Nola May stood beside her mother, holding the rest of the photo box with both hands. Beaumont parked across the road and did not step onto the porch. He had told Mabel that morning that this was her claim. If she needed someone to carry a ladder, he would carry it. If not, he would stand still. Lyle began in the yard. He took wide photos of the roof, checked the gutter, and then climbed the ladder with Miller. On the roof, the sound of boots crossing the tarp was heavy and slow. Mabel stood below, her neck aching from looking up. Nola May photographed each place the appraiser inspected, as if she were used to turning every movement into evidence. Lyle lifted one corner of the tarp, exposing the old shingles underneath. He tapped a round pockmark with his pen, its edges sharp, sitting in a section of shingle that had not faded evenly. Miller said the roof was old, and the signs of wear were obvious. Lyle didn't look at him right away. He tapped the dent one more time with the pen. Weather doesn't wear a roof out in one afternoon, gentlemen. It hits it. He pointed to another area of shingles, where the surface had faded evenly from sun and age. Then he pointed back to the hail dent and showed the small crack spreading from the point of impact. Wear spreads like dust. Impact has a center. Mabel's roof had both, but the part that had been denied was not caused by age choosing the same day to finish the job. Miller tried to move the discussion to the weekend rain. Lyle asked for the photos before the storm, the photos during the tarp work, and the photos after the storm. Nola May opened the box and pulled out each bundle clipped with rubber bands. Mabel didn't touch them. The girl handed over the photos in order, reading the dates on the back in a small but clear voice. The day of the first hailstorm, the day of the denial letter, the day the ceiling changed color, the day the old tarp tore, the day the new tarp was tied down, the day after the storm. Lyle spent a long time reviewing the photos from June through December. One photo Nola May had taken from the backyard showed a crack running from the edge of the vent pipe down into the shingle groove. In June, the crack was as thin as thread. By August, water had darkened the edges. By December, the bedroom ceiling had collapsed. The timeline didn't need anyone to cry for it. It was there on paper, photo by photo. Miller began speaking less. He typed notes into his tablet, sometimes glancing toward his car as if he wanted to call someone. Lyle came down the ladder, wiped his hands on his pants, then sat on the hood of his truck to write the report. Mabel stood a few steps away from him. Beaumont was still across the road, both hands in his pockets, looking down at the ground whenever Miller looked in his direction. The finding was read in the yard, beside the ladder still marked with mud. The roof replacement value was set at $19,400. Because the policy included recoverable depreciation, the payment would be made in 2 stages. The first payment based on actual cash value, and the remaining amount after the work was completed and the contractor's invoice was submitted on time. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't a check from a rich man. It was only the mechanism Coverstone had hidden behind enough layers of small print, hoping Mabel would never reach it. Mrs. Ellison stood by the fence, still holding a dish towel. Reed held his youngest child on his hip, the little one still wearing pajamas. Nobody dared celebrate first, because poor people learn that paperwork that opens a door today can still close it tomorrow. But when Lyle signed his name at the bottom of the report and tore off a copy for Mabel, Mrs. Ellison finally lifted a hand to her mouth. Reed lowered his head and let out a long breath. Nola May quietly took a picture of that moment too, even though no one told her to add it to the evidence file. Nola May looked at her mother. Mabel didn't cheer. She didn't hug her daughter right away either. She went inside the house, brought out Earl's cigar box, then placed it on the hood of Lyle's truck. In front of the appraiser, Miller, Beaumont, and a few neighbors standing on the porch next, she opened the lid. The $6-footed $80 check was still stapled inside. Mabel pulled it out, held it between 2 fingers, and looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. The weak sunlight fell across the words full and final payment. Then she stapled it back inside the lid, carefully, like pinning down a specimen. It was no longer a temptation, it was evidence. Miller closed his tablet, his face tightening in the way of someone who understood his next phone call would be unpleasant. But he didn't know there were 10 more files waiting on Mabel's kitchen table. He didn't know the child who had just handed photos to the appraiser had been photographing Darshall Road for months, and he definitely didn't know that across the road, Lawrence Beaumont had just taken out his phone called Atlanta and asked them to prepare a speech that no investor in Coverstone wanted to hear. The market conduct investigation did not begin with sirens or loud searches. It began with an email from the State Insurance Commission sent at 6:17 on a Monday morning, ordering Coverstone to submit all claim files related to hail-damaged roofs around Selma, along with reassignment logs, payment worksheets, bonus policies for the claims department, and every internal message containing the phrase leakage reduction. Inside Coverstone's legal office, printers ran all morning. Young employees carried stacks of documents into the conference room under white fluorescent lights. At first, they still called it a routine review request. But when investigators marked Mabel Joyner's file with a red pen, then placed 11 claim files from the same road beside it, that phrase disappeared from internal emails. Dale Kern was the first person called into the closed room. He wore a pale blue shirt and gray tie and carried a printed packet like a man prepared to prove he had done everything right. On the table, investigators placed before him the 9 times Mabel's file had been transferred to new handlers, each transfer followed by a request to resend documents already inside the system. Kern didn't pound the table. He only slid his finger down each line of the claim log, then said in the same voice he had used with poor customers for years, "I followed the program, step by step." That sense did not save him. It only helped Coverstone find its scapegoat faster. By the end of the week, the internal notice said that a claims adjuster had violated independent standards by incorrectly applying reassignment procedures. Dale Kern was fired in the same polite language he had once used to make other people so tired they gave up. He left the building with a small cardboard box, a coffee mug, 2 picture frames, a plant with dried edges, and a plastic nameplate. The security guard kept his employee badge. Kern stood beside the revolving door for a few seconds, watching coworkers pass without stopping. The machine he had served had closed the door in his face before investigators had even finished writing the report. Vicki Dunn appeared for her deposition in a cream-colored suit, her hair pulled into a tight bun. She brought her own lawyer, placed her handbag on the chair beside her, and opened a notebook with a silver pen. For the first 30 minutes, Dunn talked about efficiency, consistency, and the duty to protect the claims fund for all policyholders. She used clean words: optimization, control, discipline, transparency. Then the investigator placed the bonus table on the desk. It was not the presentation shown to investors. It was an older internal spreadsheet pulled from the regional server, with the names of managers, targets for reducing claim payouts, quick close file rates, and quarterly bonuses tied to those results. On Vicki Dunn's row, the number was highlighted in green. She looked at that spreadsheet long enough for the lawyer beside her to place a hand on the file and remind her not to answer too quickly. Dunn didn't rush. She clicked the pen closed and turned it between 2 fingers, as if straightening an object on a dining table. "Every carrier in this state does it," she said. "I'm just the one who wrote it down." The room did not react. One investigator bent down and wrote the sentence exactly as she said it. That silence made Dunn's words colder. It didn't sound like a confession. It sounded like a complaint from someone caught doing something she believed the whole industry had quietly agreed to long ago. 3 days later, Coverstone received the draft consent order, administrative fines, mandatory supervision for 18 months, the reopening of 400 roof claims that had been denied or underpaid across the region. Every file had to be reviewed by an independent unit, not controlled by Dunn's department. The company also had to send letters to homeowners whose claims had been closed, explaining their right to request a free reevaluation. Dunn was forced out of her position before the order was made public. The press release called it leaving to pursue other opportunities. In the hallway of the regional office, employees avoided looking at her as she stepped out of the elevator carrying a box of personal items. A woman who had once decided thousands of roofs through a bonus table now had to open the glass door with her elbow because the box in her arms was too full. Whit Garrison held him longer. He did not call what happened a scandal. He called it media noise after an emotional speech. On the call with the board, he said Beaumont turning a low-stool story into a bargaining weapon. He mentioned earnings, market share, political relationships, and reinsurance contracts. Coverstone, he said, could not allow a man who had just buried his mother to redefine claims policy for an entire region. But the market has its own way of listening. When Beaumont publicly divested, 2 other large funds requested emergency meetings. A teacher's pension fund asked why Alabama teachers' money had been tied to a program that pushed poor residents to give up. A church fund from Georgia requested a list of closed claims. The calls Garrison once controlled began turning into lines that did not include him. The parent company's valuation fell step by step. It did not collapse overnight like in a movie. It fell through each postponed investment email, each bank call asking for an updated risk report, and each financial news item using his claims investigation instead of stable growth. Garrison still wore good suits. He still walked through the lobby at the same pace, but his secretary began printing legal documents instead of lunch schedules. In the end, he signed the consent order. His pen paused for half a second before his signature, not long enough for anyone to record in the minutes, but long enough for the lawyer across from him to notice. Coverstone had to pay the fine, had to reopen the files, and the parent company had to fund additional payments for homeowners who had been underpaid. The vault that once rewarded holding money back was now forced open to pay for the roofs it had once avoided. Garrison did not apologize on a stage. He did not call Mabel. He did not say Nola May's name. He only stood in the conference room after signing, gripping the edge of the wooden table until his knuckles turned white, then asked the lawyer which sentence in the press release could reduce shareholder damage. The promise in the room that had laughed was finally paid, but not where anyone expected. Not under conference lights. Not in front of cameras and not in front of Mabel. That afternoon, Dunn had to leave headquarters. She went down to the parking garage alone. Her box of personal items sat on the passenger seat. Her nameplate lay face down on top of an old insurance file. She opened the car door and sat in the driver's seat, but she didn't start the engine. In the rearview mirror, her makeup still looked perfect. Only 2 red marks near the bridge of her nose had begun to show. Her phone kept buzzing, her lawyer, former coworkers, an unknown number from the local paper. Dunn turned the phone face down on the seat. She put both hands on the steering wheel and stared at the concrete wall with the arrow pointing toward the exit. For the first time, there was no template letter to edit, no cooperative phrase to hide behind. No junior adjuster to push out in front, she cried in the car. Short, sharp, angry sobs, like someone who had lost something she believed belonged to her. They were not tears of regret. She did not think about Nola May's room, or the bucket, or the $680 check. She cried because the system that once protected her had decided to save itself first. The news that the files were being reopened reached the red dirt road on a sunny morning. Mrs. Ellison brought the newspaper over. She didn't knock first. She just called Mabel's name from the yard, holding the folded local paper in her hand. Mabel was hanging bed sheets on the line behind the house. A freshly washed white sheet moved lightly in the wind while Nola May stood on the porch, clipping the corner of a blanket with a wooden clothespin. Mrs. Ellison read aloud the paragraph about 100 files being reopened. When she reached Coverstone's name, she had to stop and adjust her glasses. Mabel held one corner of the sheet, listened to the end, then reached into her apron pocket for the next clothespin. "So folks don't have to wait anymore," she said. She did not drop the sheet. She did not run inside to call anyone. She did not lift her hands like she had won a great battle. She clipped the last corner of the fabric, smoothed the wrinkle with her palm, and told Nola May to bring out the basket of towels. Some people are made to wait so long that when justice finally arrives, their bodies keep working before their hearts have time to believe it. In the weeks that followed, contractor trucks began appearing on the road that had once been covered in blue tarps. Mrs. Ellison's kitchen roof was replaced first. The Reed brothers repaired the back room for the children. Tully Mason came home from Montgomery and stood in front of his dark house, the key in his hand. Mabel walked over and gave him a copy of the new claim instruction letter. Tully took off his cap, wiped his forehead, and asked whether she still remembered how to number the photos. Mabel pointed at Nola May. Ask her. She's the one who taught this whole road. In Atlanta, Beaumont lost more than money. Gordon Voss separated from the fund quietly, sending a 6-line email as polite as an insurance denial letter. 2 former partners avoided mentioning Coverstone when they saw him at conferences. One financial article called his decision expensive ethics. Beaumont clipped that article and placed it inside the same file that held the photo of the blue tarp on Mabel's house. At Mabel's house, Earl's cigar box grew heavier. Beside the $680 check, she added a copy of the consent order, the list of reopened claims, and the photo Nola May had taken on the day Lyle Potter read his finding. When she closed the lid, for the first time in months, Mabel didn't have to press hard to make the papers lie still. They had been read. She placed the box on the kitchen shelf, right under the roof that was still waiting to be fully repaired. Outside, the clothesline was filled with white sheets, and at the end of the road, one blue tarp after another began coming down. The new roof was finished on an ordinary Friday afternoon, except that Mabel stood in the yard longer than usual. The roofers had cleaned up every fallen nail with a magnet, gathered the power cords, the aluminum ladders, and the old cracked shingles with broken edges. On the roof, the new shingles lay flat, charcoal gray, lined up so straight that Nola May kept tilting her head back as if checking one final math problem. The contractor handed Mabel the invoice right there on the porch. She signed her name with the blue ballpoint pen, still tied to the clipboard with string. The first payment had arrived after the appraisal finding, and the recoverable depreciation would be released once the completed work invoice was submitted on time. Mabel knew every step. She had read it so many times that she didn't need anyone to explain it to her in a pitying voice. That night it rained, not hard, just a steady rain, the kind that used to wake Mabel with a start and make her feel around the floor with her feet to see how far the water had spread. Nola May stood in the doorway of her room, wearing old pajamas and holding the one-eyed stuffed bear. The room had been repainted a soft cream. There was no plastic on the ceiling anymore, no tape, no brown stain like a map of a place no one wanted to go. Mabel spread the quilt back over her daughter's bed. Nola May sat down and placed her hand on the pillow, waiting by old habit for a drop of water to fall. Nothing fell. Outside the window, rain touched the new roof with a soft sound, slid into the gutter, and ran out into the yard. The girl lay down very slowly, as if moving too fast might wake up the old 14 months again. Mabel turned off the light, but she didn't leave right away. She stood outside the door and listened as her daughter's breathing slowly evened out. On the living room floor, where the sofa used to hold the bucket, there was only a thin line of light from the window. The aluminum bucket was in the shed, turned upside down. For the first time in a very long time, the house sounded like a house, not like something apologizing for failing to protect the people inside. The Joyner room opened 3 weeks later in the small room behind the Baptist church. The name had not been Beaumont's idea. Mabel wrote it on the whiteboard that first Saturday morning, then stepped back and looked at it for a while. Earl Joyner had never studied law. He had never walked into an insurance office with a clean collar and a leather briefcase in his hand. But his cigar box had taught a whole road how to keep evidence. Mabel told Pastor Clayton that if the room had to have a name, it should carry the name of the man who had kept every screw because he believed it might be needed one day. Beaumont's fund pa paid to repair the room, buy folding tables, a printer, moisture-proof filing cabinets, and a simple digital camera that anyone could borrow when they needed it. But his name was not on the door. Beaumont asked for only one thing: don't make the room so nice that poor people feel they need permission to walk in. So the walls were painted bright, the chairs were strong enough, the coffee pot was always full, and on the table near the door sat an ordinary box of tissues, like in every church activity room. The first thing people saw when they walked in was not a list of rules. It was Earl's cigar box, set on a wooden shelf at eye level. Beside it, inside a cheap glass frame, was the $680 check with the back facing outward so everyone could read the words "full and final payment" for this claim. Mabel didn't hang it there to show off a victory. She hung it there to remind people not to sign away their exhaustion just because someone printed it on nice paper. The first class had 17 people. Mrs. Ellison sat in the front row with a cloth bag full of old letters. The Reed brothers sat near the door because the little one kept running into the hallway. Tully Mason arrived later, wearing a baseball cap and holding a new folder he had bought at the dollar store. He stood in the doorway for a few seconds as if he wasn't sure whether he should enter a room named after a dead man. Mabel saw him and pulled out another chair beside the table. "Your file got reopened," she said. Tully nodded, took off his cap, and laid it on his lap. "I came back to fix the house. If you've still got room for an old man learning from the beginning again." Nola May handed him a pen and a pack of date labels. "I'll show you how to take the first pictures." Mabel stood in front of the board and didn't use big words. She taught exactly what she had done. Send certified mail, keep the receipt, take pictures with the date and time. Take wide shots first, then close-ups. When someone tells you something over the phone, ask them to send it in writing with the person's name on it. Don't let anger be your only evidence. Don't send the original if you can keep a copy. Don't sign any check with the words full and final on it until you understand exactly which door it closes. People wrote slowly. A few asked the same question twice. Mabel didn't get irritated. She knew what it felt like to sit in front of paperwork and see each line written as if to prove you didn't belong in the room. She moved from table to table, correcting the way dates were written and showing people how to clip photos in order. Beaumont stood in the back near the coffee pot with his sleeves rolled up, pouring more coffee for people who came late. He didn't talk about investments. He didn't talk about mistakes. When an elderly woman asked where he worked, he only looked toward Mabel and said that today he was just helping this room. After that day, Saturday became a rare, steady thing. People brought medical records, hospital bills, bank letters, even power shutoff notices folded inside coat pockets. Mabel did not pretend to be anyone's lawyer. She always said that clearly before they began. But she knew how to read dates, how to find small print, and how to call an office twice while keeping her voice calm. Nola May was put in charge of the camera and printer. She taped a note beside the outlet. Charge the battery before you need evidence. Tully Mason began arriving early to make coffee. He said his house wasn't fully finished yet, but the windows had light in them again. Some days, Mabel looked across the room and saw Beaumont sitting beside him, patiently learning how to fill out a certified mail receipt, and she had to turn away so she wouldn't laugh. That afternoon, after everyone had gone home, Mabel stayed behind to wipe the board. On the floor were a few paper label scraps, a coffee stain, and a pen that had run out of ink. Nola May locked the filing cabinet and checked whether the camera was charged. Beaumont carried the stack of folding chairs into the corner. In the glass frame, the old check reflected the ceiling light. Mabel looked at it, then at the cigar box. Some things don't have to disappear for a wound to heal. Some things have to be put in the right place, under enough light, so no one can use them in the dark anymore. One dry afternoon the next month, Mabel was folding kitchen towels when she heard a knock at the door. No rain. No wind. No broken down car in the yard. Nola May was doing homework in her room and looked up with a smile she tried to hide behind her pencil. Mabel opened the door. Lawrence Beaumont stood on the porch without a box in his hands, his shirt dry, his shoes so clean they looked a little out of place on the wooden step. He did not step inside right away. For the first time, there was no storm between them as an excuse, no leaking roof as a reason, no paperwork that needed signing. "I'd like to keep knocking on this door," he said, his voice lower than usual. "If that's allowed." Mabel looked at him. Then she looked down at his shoes. "Then you'd better get used to wiping your feet." Beaumont bent down to the mat like a man who had just been given a kindness bigger than an invitation. In the kitchen, Nola May laughed. Mabel didn't turn around and tell her to be quiet. That house had heard too much waterfall. It deserved to hear laughter move down the hallway once without fearing the ceiling would answer. I have thought for a long time about the unsigned check in this story. Not because $680 is a small amount of money. For a mother who had to buy asthma medicine, pay the electric bill, put gas in the car, and keep her child from sleeping under a moldy ceiling, that money was not small at all. What I remember is the staple. A woman can lose a lot of things before she loses her dignity, and sometimes dignity doesn't look like a speech or a bright, shining ending. Sometimes it only looks like a check stapled to the lid of a box, so every morning she can see it and remind herself that she has not sold the truth cheap. This story is fictional, but rooms like the Joyner Room shouldn't exist only in fiction. Somewhere, maybe even in your own home, there may be a box of papers sitting on top of a refrigerator, under a bed, or inside a kitchen drawer waiting for someone tired enough but still unwilling to give up to open it and put everything back in order. Thank you for staying until the end of the story. If this story made you think of someone who has ever been spun around by paperwork, subscribe to the channel to keep hearing stories like this. And before you leave, I want to ask you one question. Where is the paper box in your house? I'll see you in the next story.